Late June 1941. Somewhere west of Minsk, Belarus, a Soviet rifle division that had numbered 12,000 men 6 days earlier no longer existed as a coherent military formation. Scattered groups of soldiers moved eastward through forests and marshland, lacking maps, lacking orders, lacking any understanding of where German forces were or where Soviet lines might be found. The division's commanding officer had been killed on the second day of the war. His replacement, a major with 8 months of experience at his rank, had been captured while attempting to reach a headquarters that had already displaced. The men who remained possessed rifles, some ammunition, and no information whatsoever about the catastrophe unfolding around them. They were not alone in their confusion. Across a front stretching from the Baltic to the Black Sea, the Red Army was experiencing a collapse so complete that German commanders initially suspected deception. Entire armies vanished from operational maps. Corps headquarters lost contact with their divisions. Divisions lost contact with their regiments. The communication networks that should have coordinated defensive operations had been severed within hours of the invasion's opening, and the officers who might have improvised alternatives were either dead, captured, or paralyzed by a command culture that punished initiative more severely than it punished failure. The statistics that accumulated through those first weeks defied any reasonable projection of military defeat. By June 29th, German armored spearheads had advanced over 300 kilometers, encircling the Belarusian capital and trapping the remnants of 3 Soviet armies in a pocket that would yield 324,000 prisoners. The Minsk encirclement alone exceeded the total German prisoners taken by all Allied forces during the entire First World War, and Minsk was merely the first of the summer's catastrophes. The Red Army that faced Operation Barbarossa possessed material advantages that should have made such collapse impossible. Soviet tank strength exceeded 20,000 vehicles, more than the combined armored forces of every other nation on Earth. The Air Force numbered over 10,000 combat aircraft. Manpower reserves dwarfed anything Germany could mobilize, with over 5 million soldiers under arms and millions more available for conscription. The industrial base that supported these forces had been built through 2 decades of forced development, converting an agricultural nation into a military-industrial power capable of producing weapons in quantities that German planners considered exaggerated when intelligence reports reached Berlin. None of these advantages mattered in the summer of 1941. The tanks existed, but the crews lacked training, and the units lacked fuel. The aircraft existed, but 1,200 of them burned on their airfields within the invasion's first hours, destroyed by Luftwaffe strikes against bases where planes sat wingtip to wingtip in peacetime formations. The soldiers existed, but they received no orders because the communication systems had failed, and the officers who should have commanded them had been eliminated years before the first German soldier crossed the frontier. The explanation for the catastrophe that consumed the Red Army in 1941 could not be found in German tactical superiority or technological advantage. The Wehrmacht that invaded the Soviet Union was a formidable force, battle-hardened through campaigns in Poland, France, and the Balkans, led by officers who had refined mobile warfare into devastating operational art. But formidable forces had been defeated before by defenders with comparable resources and competent leadership. The Soviet Union possessed the resources. What it lacked was the leadership, and that absence was not accidental. The Red Army's destruction in 1941 was substantially self-inflicted, the consequence of decisions made in Moscow between 1937 and 1941 that systematically eliminated the officers, the doctrines, and the institutional flexibility that might have prevented catastrophe. The purges that swept through the Soviet military in the late 1930s did not merely remove individuals from command positions, they decapitated an institution, destroyed the intellectual foundations of Soviet military thought, and created a command culture so paralyzed by fear that officers chose certain defeat over the uncertain consequences of independent action. The Germans provided the killing blow. The Soviet leadership had spent 4 years ensuring its army could not survive it. The destruction began in the summer of 1937, though its roots extended deeper into the pathology of Stalinist governance. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky received orders on May 11th to travel from his command in the Volga military district to Moscow, ostensibly for reassignment. He arrived expecting a new posting. He received instead arrest, interrogation, and charges of conspiracy with Nazi Germany to overthrow the Soviet state. The accusations were fabrications, constructed from confessions extracted through torture from officers already in custody, supported by forged documents that German intelligence had helpfully provided to Soviet agents. The evidence would not have survived scrutiny in any legitimate judicial proceeding. It was not intended to. Tukhachevsky represented everything Stalin feared in his military leadership. The marshal had demonstrated genuine battlefield competence during the Russian Civil War, rising to prominence through ability rather than political connection. More dangerously, he had spent the subsequent decades developing military theories that positioned the Red Army at the forefront of doctrinal innovation. His concept of deep battle envisioned mechanized forces penetrating enemy defenses and striking operational depths simultaneously across multiple axes, paralyzing command structures and preventing coherent response. German officers studied his writings with professional respect. Soviet officers implemented his ideas in training exercises and force structure planning. The Red Army of the mid-1930s was being shaped by Tukhachevsky's vision of modern warfare. The trial lasted 1 day. On June 11, 1937, a special military tribunal composed of judges who would themselves face execution within 18 months convicted Tukhachevsky and 7 co-defendants of treason. The sentences were carried out within hours. Marshal Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the man who had understood armored warfare more deeply than perhaps any officer in Europe, was shot in the basement of Lubyanka prison. He was 44 years old. His death marked not an ending, but an acceleration. The purge that had claimed Tukhachevsky expanded through the summer and autumn of 1937 into an institutional devastation without parallel in military history. Stalin's suspicion, once focused on potential rivals, metastasized into a systematic elimination of professional competence itself. Officers who had served with Tukhachevsky became suspects. Officers who had implemented his doctrines became suspects. Officers who had studied at the same academies, served in the same units, or expressed admiration for modern military methods became suspects. The arrests fed upon themselves. Each confession under torture generated new names, new accusations, new victims. The statistics of destruction accumulated with mechanical precision. Of the 5 marshals who held the Soviet Union's highest military rank in 1937, 3 were executed and 1 imprisoned. Of 15 army commanders, 13 were eliminated. Of 57 corps commanders, 50 faced arrest, and all but 7 were shot. Of 186 division commanders, 154 were removed. The percentages grew more severe at each descending level of command, as if the purge deliberately targeted the middle ranks, where operational expertise concentrated. Regimental and battalion commanders vanished in proportions that left units leaderless during the critical years when war was clearly approaching. The total numbers reached approximately 30,000 officers removed from service between 1937 and 1939, with executions numbering between 11,000 and 15,000 depending on which archives are consulted. The uncertainty in the figures reflects not scholarly dispute, but the chaos of the purge itself, where documentation was destroyed, falsified, or never created. Some officers were shot without trial. Others disappeared into the Gulag system and died of causes that went unrecorded. The precise accounting of the dead remained incomplete because the system that killed them maintained no interest in precise accounting. What these numbers represented extended beyond individual tragedies. Each executed officer carried knowledge that could not be replaced through any training program or institutional process. A corps commander understood how to coordinate divisions across operational distances. A division commander understood how to synchronize infantry, armor, and artillery in combined arms attacks. These skills required years to develop and existed only in the minds of men who had spent careers acquiring them. When Stalin's executioners put bullets into those minds, the knowledge died with them. The intellectual devastation extended beyond the elimination of individuals. Tukhachevsky's theories on mechanized warfare had represented the most sophisticated military thinking in Europe during the 1930s, a body of doctrine that foreign officers studied with genuine respect and occasional alarm. The concept of deep battle that he had developed and refined through years of exercises and war games anticipated the operational methods that German forces would employ with devastating effect in Poland, France, and eventually the Soviet Union itself. When Stalin's executioners eliminated Tukhachevsky and his associates, it did not merely remove the men who had created these ideas, it criminalized the ideas themselves. The mechanisms of this intellectual destruction operated through fear rather than explicit prohibition. No decree announced that advocacy of mobile warfare constituted treason. No order specified that discussion of operational depth indicated sympathy with executed conspirators. The message transmitted itself through observation and inference. Officers noticed which colleagues disappeared and what those colleagues had advocated. They noticed which doctrines the disappeared had championed and which formations they had commanded. The conclusions required no formal instruction. Expressing enthusiasm for armored exploitation or deep penetration operations marked an officer as professionally aligned with men who had been shot as traitors. Survival demanded visible rejection of everything the dead had represented. The doctrinal regression that followed transformed the Red Army from an institution exploring the frontiers of modern warfare into one retreating towards the certainties of an earlier era. Infantry primacy replaced combined arms integration as the dominant operational concept. Linear defensive positions replaced the elastic defense in depth that Tukhachevsky had advocated. The tank, which Soviet theorists had recognized as the decisive weapon of future warfare, was redistributed from concentrated armored formations into infantry support battalions, where its operational potential could not be realized. The organizational innovations of the early 1930s were systematically dismantled, not because they had proven ineffective, but because their architects had been executed. The officer corps that survived the purge learned lessons that would prove catastrophic when war arrived. Initiative became dangerous, independent judgment became suspect. The safest course for any commander was rigid adherence to orders from above, regardless of whether those orders reflected current tactical reality. An officer who modified his operations based on local conditions risked accusations of deviation from approved methods. An officer who followed orders precisely, even when those orders guaranteed defeat, could claim obedience as defense against charges of sabotage or conspiracy. The incentive structure rewarded passive compliance and punished adaptive thinking. This institutional paralysis manifested in training exercises that bore no resemblance to actual combat conditions. Maneuvers proceeded according to scripts that ensured successful outcomes regardless of tactical validity. Commanders learned to report results that superiors wished to hear rather than results that reflected genuine capability. The feedback mechanisms that should have identified weaknesses and driven improvement were corrupted by fear into systems that concealed problems and manufactured false confidence. Reports flowing upward through the chain of command painted pictures of readiness that existed only on paper. Foreign observers noted the deterioration with varying degrees of comprehension. German military intelligence tracked the purge's progress through Soviet military publications, observing the disappearance of names and the shifting emphasis in doctrinal writing. Assessment reports concluded that the Red Army had been severely weakened, though analysts debated whether the damage was temporary or permanent. Some German officers believed the Soviets would require a decade to rebuild competent leadership. Others argued that the fundamental material strength of the Soviet military would compensate for leadership deficiencies. None fully appreciated how deeply the purge had penetrated, how thoroughly it had destroyed not merely individuals, but the institutional capacity for effective military response. The Finnish campaign of 1939–1940 provided brutal confirmation of the damage. The Red Army that invaded Finland in November 1939 possessed overwhelming numerical and material superiority against a nation of fewer than 4 million people. The initial offensive anticipated victory within weeks. Instead, Finnish forces inflicted casualties that shocked observers worldwide. Soviet units advanced into prepared defenses without reconnaissance, without coordination, without the tactical flexibility that modern warfare demanded. The final victory, achieved through sheer mass after months of humiliating setbacks, cost over 120,000 Soviet dead against a Finnish nation that lost approximately 25,000. The Finnish catastrophe exposed deficiencies that Soviet leadership could no longer ignore, yet the remedies applied addressed symptoms rather than causes. The purge had created approximately 30,000 vacancies in the officer corps, positions that required immediate filling regardless of whether qualified candidates existed. The solution adopted was mass promotion on a scale that guaranteed institutional incompetence. Lieutenants became majors, captains became colonels. Men who had commanded platoons found themselves responsible for regiments, their advancement reflecting not demonstrated ability, but the simple mathematics of empty positions requiring warm bodies. The promotion criteria that governed these elevations prioritized political reliability above all other considerations. An officer's relationship with party structures, his demonstrated orthodoxy in ideological matters, and his willingness to denounce colleagues carried greater weight than tactical knowledge or leadership experience. The commissar system that shadowed military command at every level ensured that political officers held effective veto power over operational decisions. A commander who proposed actions that his commissar considered politically questionable could find himself facing accusations that ended careers and sometimes lives. The safest commanders were those who proposed nothing, risked nothing, and deferred all significant decisions upward. The training establishments that should have prepared these hastily promoted officers for their new responsibilities had themselves been devastated by the purge. The senior instructors at military academies had been drawn from the same pool of experienced officers that Stalin's executioners had targeted. Faculties were decimated. Curricula were revised to eliminate concepts associated with purged theorists. The academies that once produced officers capable of commanding modern combined arms formations now graduated men whose education emphasized political conformity over operational competence. A colonel emerging from the Frunze Military Academy in 1940 had received fundamentally different preparation than his counterpart of 1936, and the difference manifested in capabilities that combat would ruthlessly expose. The statistics that accumulated by 1941 documented an officer corps defined by inexperience. 75% of all Red Army officers had held their current positions for less than 1 year. This figure captured not routine rotation, but the continuing aftershocks of purge and reorganization, as commands changed hands repeatedly through arrest, execution, rehabilitation, and transfer. A division commander in June 1941 had likely held his position for months rather than years, commanded subordinates he barely knew, and reported to superiors whose own tenures were equally brief. The institutional relationships that should have enabled coordinated operations simply did not exist. The mechanized corps that represented Soviet offensive capability illustrated the dysfunction with particular clarity. These formations had been disbanded following the Purge's elimination of their advocates, reconstituted after the Finnish War demonstrated the necessity of armored concentration, and then expanded to a scale that available leadership could not possibly support. By June 1941, the Red Army possessed 29 mechanized corps on paper, formations that should have fielded over 29,000 tanks, with supporting infantry and artillery. The tanks existed in substantial numbers. The officers qualified to command armored operations at corps level did not. A mechanized corps required coordination across dozens of subordinate units, synchronization of movement and logistics across operational distances, and commanders who understood how armored formations fought. The Soviet Union in 1941 possessed perhaps a handful of officers with genuine expertise in these matters, survivors of the Purge who had escaped execution through luck or obscurity. These few could not possibly command 29 corps. The remaining positions were filled by cavalry officers, infantry officers, and political appointees, whose understanding of mechanized warfare derived from manuals rather than experience. They would lead their formations into battle against German panzer divisions commanded by officers who had spent years refining armored doctrine through actual combat. The rehabilitation efforts that Stalin initiated following Finland restored some purged officers to duty, recognizing belatedly that the army required professional competence to fight. Konstantin Tukhachevsky, who had endured 3 years in prison camps after arrest in 1937, returned to command a mechanized corps. His teeth had been knocked out during interrogation. His fingernails had been torn away. He resumed his duties without complaint, understanding that complaint meant death. Other rehabilitated officers returned similarly damaged, their loyalty to the system that had tortured them less relevant than their irreplaceable knowledge of how armies actually functioned. They were too few, restored too late to reverse the institutional collapse that the Purge had engineered. The warnings that accumulated through the spring of 1941 formed a pattern so unmistakable that only willful blindness could explain the Soviet failure to respond. German reconnaissance aircraft crossed Soviet airspace with increasing frequency, photographing military installations, airfields, and defensive positions along the western frontier. Soviet air defense commanders reported these violations through proper channels, requesting authorization to intercept. The authorization never came. Stalin had forbidden any action that might be interpreted as provocation, convinced that Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated. The German aircraft completed their missions and returned with intelligence that would guide the opening strikes of Barbarossa. The human intelligence flowing into Moscow painted an equally unambiguous picture. Richard Sorgi, the Soviet agent embedded in the German embassy in Tokyo, transmitted warnings throughout the spring that included specific details of German intentions. His reports identified the approximate date of the invasion, the strength of forces being assembled, and the operational objectives that German planning envisioned. Soviet military attachés in Berlin reported the massive troop movements occurring across German-occupied Poland, concentrations that no defensive rationale could explain. Deserters from the German army crossed into Soviet territory and provided interrogators with unit identifications, assembly areas, and timetabling. The information converged from multiple independent sources towards a single conclusion that Stalin refused to accept. The consequences of this refusal cascaded through the military command structure in ways that guaranteed catastrophe. Defensive preparations required authorization from Moscow, and Moscow would not authorize measures that implied distrust of German intentions. Fortifications along the new western border, established after the 1939 partition of Poland, remained incomplete and largely unmanned. The older fortification lines further east had been stripped of their weapons and garrisons, their defensive value sacrificed to the assumption that war would be fought forward. Soviet forces occupied positions that were neither prepared for defense nor concentrated for counterattack, deployed in a disposition that maximized vulnerability while minimizing response capability. The air forces suffered particular exposure to the coming storm. Soviet aviation doctrine positioned aircraft at forward airfields close to the frontier, enabling rapid offensive operations but creating targets of extraordinary density. Regulations required aircraft to be parked in neat geometric rows, facilitating inspection and maintenance, while ensuring that a single strafing pass could destroy dozens of machines. Dispersal would have reduced vulnerability, but implied expectation of attack, an implication that commanders understood could end careers. Base commanders who suggested protective measures risked accusations of panic-mongering or defeatism. The aircraft remained in their rows. General Georgy Zhukov, who had assumed the position of Chief of the General Staff in January 1941, recognized the danger with professional clarity. His proposals for partial mobilization, forward deployment of reserves, and activation of defensive plans encountered resistance, not from military colleagues, but from political leadership that controlled all significant decisions. Stalin's conviction that mobilization would provoke the very attack it was meant to deter overrode professional military judgment. Zhukov could advise, he could not compel. The army he was nominally responsible for preparing remained unprepared, because the authority to prepare it resided with a man who believed preparation unnecessary. The final days before invasion acquired a surreal quality in retrospect. German forces completed their assembly along the frontier, 3 million soldiers in positions that permitted no interpretation other than imminent attack. Soviet border guards reported the activity in detail. Foreign intelligence services, including British warnings derived from ultra-decrypts, communicated German intentions through diplomatic channels. Stalin dismissed the British warnings as provocations designed to draw the Soviet Union into war with Germany. He dismissed his own intelligence services as alarmists whose reports reflected professional bias toward threat inflation. He dismissed the physical evidence accumulating along his western border as German deception or routine military exercises. On the evening of June 21, 1941, a German deserter crossed into Soviet lines and informed his interrogators that the attack would begin within hours. The report reached Moscow. Stalin authorized a warning to frontier commands that arrived too late for meaningful response and contained instructions so hedged with caution that commanders could not determine what actions were actually permitted. The Red Army entered the most destructive military campaign in human history, having been forbidden to prepare for an attack that everyone except its supreme leader had recognized as inevitable. June 22, 1941, 3:15 a.m. The eastern horizon erupted along an 1,800-mile front stretching from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. German artillery batteries that had moved into position during the final hours of darkness opened fire simultaneously, their shells falling on Soviet border installations, communication centers, and troop concentrations that had been precisely mapped during months of aerial reconnaissance. 3 million German soldiers began advancing across the frontier in the largest military operation in human history. The Red Army that faced them possessed greater numbers of tanks, aircraft, and soldiers. It possessed almost nothing else that modern warfare required. The Luftwaffe strikes that accompanied the ground assault achieved destruction on a scale that air power theorists had imagined but never witnessed. German bombers and fighters crossed into Soviet airspace at dawn, navigating toward airfields whose locations had been photographed repeatedly during the spring's reconnaissance flights. They found their targets exactly as intelligence had promised. Aircraft parked in geometric rows, wingtip to wingtip, presenting target density that maximized the effectiveness of every bomb and bullet. The first strikes destroyed aircraft before pilots could reach their cockpits, burning them on runways that became obstacle courses of wreckage. By noon on the first day, the Soviet Air Force had lost approximately 1,200 aircraft, the overwhelming majority destroyed on the ground without contributing anything to the defense. Entire air divisions ceased to exist as functional formations within hours. The aerial umbrella that should have protected ground forces from German air attack had been eliminated before most Soviet soldiers understood that war had begun. The Luftwaffe achieved air superiority not through combat but through massacre, and the ground forces advancing beneath that superiority would exploit it for months to come. The communication systems that should have coordinated Soviet response failed almost immediately. German special operations units had infiltrated across the border during the night, targeting telephone lines and signal stations with precision that reflected careful preparation. The redundant communication networks that modern armies required simply did not exist in adequate density. When primary lines were cut, alternatives were insufficient or non-existent. Headquarters lost contact with subordinate units. Subordinate units lost contact with each other. The information that commanders required to make decisions stopped flowing within hours of the invasion's opening. The paralysis that descended on Soviet command structures reflected something deeper than technical failure. Officers who retained communication capability faced decisions that the institutional culture of the Purge years had rendered impossible. Standing orders prohibited retreat without explicit authorization from higher headquarters. Higher headquarters could not be reached. Standing orders prohibited offensive action without coordination across adjacent units. Adjacent units could not be contacted. The doctrine that governed response assumed functioning command systems that no longer existed, leaving officers to choose between unauthorized action and passive destruction. Many chose passivity. Units remained in positions that German forces had already bypassed, awaiting orders that would never arrive. Commanders who recognized the necessity of withdrawal hesitated to give commands that might later be characterized as cowardice or defeatism. The fear that had governed Soviet military culture since 1937 did not disappear because German shells were falling. Officers who had survived the purge by avoiding initiative did not suddenly embrace independent judgment because circumstances demanded it. They had learned too thoroughly that initiative killed. The reports reaching Moscow during the first hours conveyed confusion rather than comprehension. Stalin initially refused to believe that full-scale invasion had begun, insisting that the attacks represented unauthorized actions by German commanders that diplomatic contact could resolve. His directive to frontier forces, issued hours after the assault commenced, authorized defensive fire but prohibited crossing into German territory, as if the operational situation permitted such distinctions. The Supreme Commander's psychological inability to accept the reality unfolding along his borders added hours of delay to responses that were already fatally compromised. By the time Stalin acknowledged that war had truly begun, the Western military districts had largely ceased to exist as coherent defensive structures. The encirclements began within days and multiplied through the summer with a regularity that suggested industrial process rather than military campaign. German armored spearheads did not attack Soviet formations directly when alternatives existed. They flowed around defensive positions, seeking gaps and weak points, converging behind Soviet units to sever retreat routes and supply lines. The infantry following these armored thrusts completed the encirclement, forming cordons that trapped hundreds of thousands of soldiers in pockets where resistance became meaningless and surrender inevitable. The Minsk pocket closed on June 28, barely a week after the invasion commenced. 3 Soviet armies that had defended the Belarusian military district found themselves surrounded, their supply lines cut, their communication with higher headquarters severed, their ammunition exhausting against enemies who attacked from every direction. The fighting continued for days as isolated units attempted breakouts that German forces systematically crushed. When organized resistance finally ceased, 324,000 Soviet soldiers marched into captivity. The prisoners included the remnants of formations that had represented the core of Soviet defensive strength in the Western theater. The pattern repeated at Smolensk in August, where another pocket yielded 310,000 prisoners after weeks of fighting that consumed Soviet reserves faster than they could be mobilized. At Uman in the south, 103,000 soldiers surrendered when encirclement eliminated alternatives. Each pocket represented not merely numerical loss, but the destruction of institutional capability, the elimination of officers and specialists whose knowledge could not be replaced through any crash training program. The men who understood how to coordinate artillery fires, how to maintain armored vehicles, how to establish communication networks under combat conditions were marching into German prison camps where most would die before spring. The Kiev encirclement that developed through September exceeded all previous catastrophes in scale. Stalin had forbidden the abandonment of the Ukrainian capital despite the operational situation that made its defense impossible. German forces advancing from the north and south converged east of the city, completing an encirclement that trapped 4 Soviet armies in a pocket measuring roughly 130 kilometers across. Marshal Semyon Budyonny, commanding the southwestern front, had requested permission to withdraw before the trap closed. Stalin refused. Budyonny was relieved of command. His replacement inherited an impossible situation and orders that guaranteed disaster. The fighting within the Kiev pocket lasted until September 26, when organized resistance finally collapsed. The prisoners taken numbered 665,000, the largest single capture in military history. Among them were the commander of the 5th Army and the commander of the 21st Army, generals whose experience represented irreplaceable institutional assets. The Southwestern Front had effectively ceased to exist. The forces that should have defended the approaches to the Donbass industrial region and the Caucasus oil fields had been eliminated not through combat attrition but through a strategic decision made in Moscow by a leader who understood politics far better than he understood war. The cumulative prisoner totals by October defied comprehension. German records documented the capture of over 3 million Soviet soldiers in the first 4 months of the campaign. The figure exceeded the entire peacetime strength of most national armies. It represented losses that no military organization in history had sustained while continuing to function. The Red Army continued to function only because the Soviet Union possessed manpower reserves that could absorb such hemorrhaging and industrial capacity that had been relocated beyond German reach during the desperate summer months. The prisoners themselves faced conditions that transformed capture into delayed execution. German planning anticipated rapid Soviet collapse and made minimal provision for prisoners who would require feeding, housing, and transportation. The millions of captured soldiers were concentrated in open-air enclosures without shelter, sanitation, or adequate food supply. German policy regarded Slavic prisoners as subhuman, unworthy of the provisions that international law required and that German forces provided to Western prisoners. The death rates in these camps during the winter of 1941 to 1942 reached levels that constituted deliberate extermination. Of the 3.35 million Soviet soldiers captured by December 1941, approximately 2 million would be dead within 6 months. The human cost of 1941 exceeded any accounting system designed for conventional military losses. Soviet combat deaths during the 6 months following June 22 reached approximately 800,000, a figure that surpassed the total military dead suffered by the United States across both world wars combined. These were soldiers killed in action, men who died in defensive positions overrun by German advances, in desperate counterattacks ordered by commanders who possessed no alternatives, in encirclements where ammunition exhausted before hope. Their deaths represented the visible portion of a catastrophe whose full dimensions remained hidden for decades behind Soviet censorship and archival restrictions. The prisoners who had marched into German captivity constituted losses of a different character. Men who might have survived to fight again had their captors regarded them as human beings worthy of preservation. The 3.35 million soldiers captured by December 1941 entered a system designed to destroy them. Starvation rations, exposure to winter conditions without shelter, epidemic disease spreading through overcrowded enclosures, and deliberate brutality combined to produce mortality rates that constituted genocide by administrative decision. By March 1942, over 2 million of these prisoners were dead. The killing required no gas chambers or firing squads, merely the systematic denial of food and shelter to men whom Nazi ideology classified as subhuman. The total Soviet military losses for 1941 thus approached 4 million dead, a figure that exceeded the entire military death toll of any other nation for the complete duration of the Second World War. Germany would lose approximately 5 million military dead across 6 years of fighting on multiple fronts. The Soviet Union lost nearly that number in 6 months on a single front, in a campaign that represented not the war's culmination but its opening phase. The scale defied comparison with any previous military disaster. It represented institutional collapse translated into human corpses. The army that survived this annihilation did so through resources the Purge had not destroyed. The Soviet population provided manpower reserves that could absorb losses no other nation could sustain. The industrial base that had been frantically relocated eastward during the summer months, entire factories dismantled and transported beyond German reach, began producing replacement equipment in quantities that would eventually overwhelm German manufacturing capacity. The geographic depth of Soviet territory provided space to trade for time, allowing defensive lines to stabilize when German logistics could no longer support continued advance. These factors, not military competence, preserved the Soviet state through the winter of 1941. The institutional damage inflicted by the Purge years manifested in every aspect of the catastrophe. The officers who might have organized coherent defense had been executed in 1937 and 1938. The doctrines that might have enabled effective response had been abandoned as ideologically contaminated. The command culture that might have permitted adaptive action had been replaced by paralysis rooted in terror. The warnings that might have prompted preparation had been ignored by a supreme leader whose paranoia had created the very weakness he refused to acknowledge. Each element of the disaster traced backward to decisions made in Moscow years before the first German soldier crossed the frontier. The Red Army that eventually drove German forces back to Berlin bore little resemblance to the force that had disintegrated in 1941. It was rebuilt through brutal experience, learning lessons that its pre-war leadership had understood and its Purge-era leadership had forbidden. Officers who survived the opening campaigns developed the skills that training had failed to provide. Doctrines that had been criminalized were quietly rehabilitated as operational necessity overrode ideological prohibition. The institution reconstructed itself under fire, but the reconstruction required years and cost millions of additional lives that competent preparation might have preserved. The self-inflicted nature of 1941's catastrophe remained officially unacknowledged for decades. Soviet historiography attributed the disaster to German surprise, to overwhelming enemy strength, to factors that absolved leadership of responsibility. The purge was not discussed, the warnings were not mentioned, the institutional paralysis was not examined. Only after the Soviet Union itself collapsed did archives open sufficiently to document what survivors had always known. The Red Army's deadliest year had been substantially caused by the Red Army's own government, which had systematically destroyed the capacity for effective defense and then forbidden the preparations that might have compensated for that destruction.
Free audio post-production by alphonic.com